By the 1980s, corporate America had fully embraced, or at least accepted, diversity tracking and training. But something interesting happened. What started as legal compliance gradually conformed into diversity as business case. Companies began arguing that diversity wasn't just legally required, it was good for business. Studies showing that diverse teams were more innovative cropped up. Understanding diverse customers required diverse employees. Global businesses needed culturally competent workers. This reached its peak in the 2000s and the 2010s with the explosion of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, as its specialized corporate function. Companies hired chief diversity officers. They created elaborate metrics and dashboards tracking representation. They launched mentorship programs, sponsorship initiatives, employee resource groups. As an executive recruiter, I hired my share of chief diversity officers and held quarterly gatherings of several from major corporations to discuss common challenges and opportunities. But here's where it gets complicated. Despite all the investment and effort, progress was frustratingly slow. According to various reports, women still held only about 20 to 30% of C-suite positions. Blacks and Hispanic professionals remained significantly underrepresented in senior leadership. The statistics varied by industry and company, but the pattern was consistent. Lots of activity, limited results. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 triggered another wave of corporate diversity commitments. Companies released statements, pledged billions of dollars, set ambitious representation goals, but critics pointed out that many of these commitments echoed promises made decades earlier that were never fully realized. And then came January 2025. Executive Order 14151 declared that many DEI programs violate civil rights laws, the same laws that originally created the pressure for these programs. The order specifically targeted race-conscious hiring and promotion practices, diversity training that suggests certain groups are inherently privileged or oppressed, employee resource groups that exclude based on protected characteristics, grants, contracts, and programs that prioritize certain demographic groups. The irony is striking. Civil rights laws were used to create diversity programs, and now they're being used to dismantle them. The legal interpretation of what constitutes discrimination has fundamentally shifted. Within weeks, corporate America responded with remarkable speed, much faster than they had adopted DEI programs in the first place. Major corporations began removing diversity language from the websites and materials, dissolving or rebranding DEI departments, reassigning or laying off their chief diversity officers, canceling the diversity training programs, restructuring employee resource groups. The list goes on and on. This rapid reversal tells us something important about whether these initiatives were ever deeply embedded corporate culture or simply responses to external pressure. When the pressure changed direction, so did the corporate behavior, almost instantly. So I asked AI systems to analyze what this moment reveals about corporate diversity efforts and what actually drives equitable outcomes in organizations. What does the research show about merit, bias, and representation? The responses were eye-opening and point to something we've been avoiding. The real problem was never that we needed DEI programs. The problem was, and remains, what our supposedly merit-based systems were never actually merit-based to begin with. AI pointed to extensive research showing that even when organizations claim to evaluate purely on merit, they consistently favor relationships. People hire and promote those that they know, they like, and feel comfortable with. Pedigree. Candidates from prestigious schools or companies get preferential treatment regardless of actual performance. Loyalty. Long tenure is rewarded even when performance is mediocre. Cultural fit. Undefined, subjective criteria that consistently favor people similar to existing leadership. My favorite, executive presence. Again, subjective essentialism that correlate to demographic characteristics, not competence. One comprehensive analysis found that when companies claim to make objective hiring decisions without structured processes, they actually make more biased decisions, not fewer. Unstructured interviews, vague evaluation criteria, and reliance on gut feeling consistently produce homogeneous workforces, more of the same, not because of intentional discrimination, but because of how human decision-making actually works. AI went on to highlight research in what actually produces both merit-based outcomes and diverse representation, which includes structured interviews with standardized questions tied to actual job requirements. What these approaches have in common is that they make evaluation generally objective rather than relying on subjective judgment, relationships, or pedigree. And here's a fascinating finding. When organizations implement only merit-based system with these structured safeguards, representation of women and minorities improves naturally, not because the standards are lowered, but because barriers to recognize competence are removed. What strikes me about this AI analysis is the uncomfortable truth it reveals. We've been having the wrong argument for 60 years. The debate has been framed as diversity programs versus merit. But that's a false dichotomy. The real question is whether our evaluation systems actually measure merit or whether they measure proximity to power. Similarly to existing leadership and access to networks and pedigree. Most organizations have never had true merit-based systems. I know this to be true from having been an executive recruiter for over 20 years, including at one of the world's largest search firms. I know this for having supported recruiting efforts for over 10 years at 3 Fortune 100 companies and 1 Fortune 10 company. I'm not trying to disparage any of these organizations, but they've had relationship-based, pedigree-based, loyalty-based systems that they called merit-based because that sounds more legitimate than we promote people who remind us of ourselves, however unintentionally. DEI programs were created to address this problem, but they often became compliance theater, tracking demographics and running training programs rather than fundamentally reforming the biased systems that create unequal outcomes. So here's where we are. DEI programs are being dismantled, but the underlying problem, systems that claim to be merit-based but aren't, remains unchanged. This could simply return us to the pre-DEI status quo, where biased systems produce unequal outcomes and everyone pretends it's okay because of merit differences rather than system design. Or, and this is an opportunity hidden in the disruption, leaders could finally address the actual problem. If you truly believe in a meritocracy, prove it. Not by pointing to the absence of DEI programs, but by implementing genuinely objective evaluation systems. Here's what's interesting. If leaders actually implemented these practices, they wouldn't need DEI programs to achieve diverse representation. Competence would equal merit. And when that's consistently honored, you would naturally see greater representation across demographics because talent is actually distributed across all groups. The reason this hasn't happened isn't because it's difficult or expensive. It's because it requires leaders to give up the comfortable practices that favor people like them. Hiring from their alma maters, promoting people they golf with, trusting their gut rewarding loyalty over performance. It's easier to have a chief diversity officer and some training programs than to fundamentally change how power and opportunity are distributed. But now that the DEI infrastructure is gone, the question becomes, will leaders actually build merit-based systems, or will they simply return to the biased systems that created the problem in the first place? So here we are at a crossroads. The DEI programs that were supposed to create equal opportunity have been dismantled, but those programs were always addressing symptoms rather than causes, trying to diversify outcomes produced by fundamentally biased systems rather than fixing the systems themselves.